Hello, community. This evening I want to share a story with you. To be honest, I'm not sure where to begin, and I know it might sound unbelievable, but I hope you'll give me a chance to explain. Some might dismiss this as just another strange tale, and I can't blame them. I used to think the same way. It all started some time ago while my family and I were flipping through an old photo album. Among the familiar faces, we came across a photograph of my grandmother that none of us had seen before. She was with a group of her friends, but one figure stood out, a woman of peculiar appearance, dressed entirely in black with a long, shadowy veil. The only part of her skin visible were her hands, ancient, wrinkled, almost skeletal. Her presence cast a grim shadow over the image, which was already eerie due to its faded quality. The woman in black seemed different from the others, as if she didn't quite belong. Perhaps she was a ghost. Her figure appeared more washed out, more ethereal than the rest. But of course she was not a ghost. It is just a way to explain how macabre that photograph looked, like any old photograph that deteriorates over time. Photographs in which only dead people remain. I asked my mother and she did not know who it was. We asked some of my aunts and finally someone remembered her. She told me that it was a woman who had been widowed young, barely at 45 years old. From then on, she promised to live in permanent mourning until her death. She never removed that black veil except to enter the church. She dedicated her life to the memory of her late husband. The story was sad, but to me, of course, it was a great opportunity to tell a story. So at the next gathering, when my younger nieces and nephews arrived, I seized the moment. I took advantage and told them the following. Children, you know what happens in this house, right? The reason it has not been sold, the reason we only come to visit when necessary, but why no one lives here. This house is haunted. My grandparents stated in their will that it should not be sold because no one deserved to suffer what they suffered in their final years of life, when they were tormented by a ghost. My grandparents lived a very happy marriage for many years, as you already know. They were lucky enough to marry their first love. How much they loved each other since their adolescence. But like any long, very long marriage, there were ups and downs. That is something you will learn with time. Of course, your parents are not going to tell you about that stage of the grandparents' lives. But at some point, Grandpa found himself somewhat excited, perhaps platonically in love, with Socorro, one of Grandma's friends. She realized that he seemed very pleased to see her whenever she came to visit. He greeted her with a special smile, and noticed that the lady also smiled with a special happiness when she saw him. Before, when the group of friends arrived, Grandpa would leave the house for a while to go for a walk. He would take care of his garden or go up to his room simply to take a nap or pass the time. But now, when Socorro came, he looked for some excuse to stay nearby. He spent a long time in the kitchen preparing himself a coffee, and then sat down to drink it slowly, hoping that Socorro would come to the kitchen for something or simply pass by in the hallway on her way to the bathroom. When that happened, it made him happy. And when he noticed Socorro's smile, her blushing cheeks, Grandpa's heart beat a little faster. He was not that old yet, and he had always been quite handsome. Grandma's friends had always told her to take good care of him because there was never a shortage of shameless women lurking around. One of those friends noticed the smiles, the blushing faces, the slow coffee preparation. She noticed everything. And there are women for whom such gossip is their very life. People who have nothing else to do but talk about others. She told Grandma to pay attention, but of course first she shared it with the rest of the group of friends. That is why, at one of the following gatherings, they decided it would be better to settle in the garden, far from Grandpa, knowing that eventually someone would go in to use the bathroom or get a glass of water. And of course, when they saw Grandpa off in the distance preparing his coffee, the one who decided to go inside was Socorro, just to use the bathroom, of course, but always with that intention of greeting him. When she came out of the bathroom, Grandpa said good afternoon, and he immediately noticed how Socorro blushed. He offered her a coffee, and she accepted. Outside, they were not drinking coffee. She sat down at the table, and they talked about the weather while Grandpa got his coffee maker going again. It was then, after a couple of minutes, that all the ladies came in, almost forcing Grandma to accuse Socorro of being a husband stealer. Grandma did not say anything after all, they were only chatting, each one at a different end of the small dining table, although of course she noticed that both of them were blushing. But the ladies did not stop. They were cruel, very cruel, with what they said to Socorro, that widow who had taken refuge in their group of friends and who now had nothing left. Mrs. Socorro went back to her house from where she never came out again. No one ever saw her again. She did not even go out to buy bread or tortillas, not even to the little market to buy breakfast with pot-style coffee that she loved so much. They found her months later, when the remaining family came to visit her. She had been dead for weeks. Her body was already dry, and those full pink hands had become dry, with the skin sticking to the bone. Her body had not decomposed completely. It seemed mummified. Grandma forgave Grandpa because, in the end, there was not much he had really done. The ones she never forgave were her friends, who only met one more time after Socorro's corpse was discovered. Grandma knew they were responsible for the way in which they had humiliated her, for the way they had spoken to her, for the way they had humiliated that widow. Someone else did not forgive them either. She did not forgive anyone. Because you see, cousins, in all the houses of each one of those ladies in the group, including this one of my grandmother's, something could be heard every night at 12 o'clock, right at midnight. Someone's fingers tapping a chair, just as Socorro would do out of anxiety after her husband's death. Also here, every time she came, she sat in that chair where no one likes to sit. The first time they heard it, my grandparents both went out to see what that sound was, only to see in the deepest darkness, at the blackest end of the living room, the silhouette of Socorro tapping the chair, distressed. My grandparents went back to their room and never again came out at midnight, no matter what they might hear. This, as I tell you, happened in all the houses of those ladies. Some told others about it, some did not. They all knew that every midnight without fail they would hear her again. And you have already seen her. Because you see that photograph of Grandma we found, do you remember it? That faded photograph is from Grandma's last gathering with her group of friends. That photograph where there also appears by her side a woman dressed in black with a veil covering her face. Socorro, months after her death. When my uncles found out about the story I told my cousins, they got very angry. The funny thing is that it happened a long time after I told it. I would say almost a year later, when someone distant, who I certainly had not told the story, started screaming, "The witch! The witch!" when they found that photograph of Grandma and her friends. I realized that I had gone too far. I asked where they had heard that story, how they knew about Socorro's tale, and at that moment they knew it was me. It turns out my cousins told that story to those who were not present, and then the rest of my cousins told it to second cousins, and then some of their parents, and finally it reached even my grandmother's brother. I do not have much contact with him, but I was frightened when they told me he wanted to talk to me. When I went to see him, the first thing he did was to scold me for staining the memory of my grandparents, their memory. That perfect marriage, an example for the whole family. I could not even speak because of my uncle's anger. I tried to explain, but he would not let me. Then he said something that shook me out of that trance I had fallen into while enduring his scolding. Besides, I do not even know how you found out about that, but it was just a rumor, always, that your grandfather was somewhat in love with one of my sister's friends. May she rest in peace. May both of them rest in peace. I never knew with whom, but it would make sense if it was that one friend who never came back. The truth is, I do not even remember their names. They have all been dead for decades. Grandma's brother was already quite old, over 90 years old, and at that moment I understood, or I wanted to understand, that he was mixing up the story he had just heard with some memory, a rumor, a ghost story. He was filling in missing spaces in his memory, practically constructing memories. My story was slipping into someone else's memories, modifying a reality that someone believed to be real. And that is when I later learned that it started being told as if it had truly happened. It became part of the things people shared. It became family gossip and conversation. It became real. Years passed until we came to the last part of this story, when something very strange happened to us, and when I changed my perspective on the paranormal. My mother and I lived in a house next to the mountain, a nice middle-class area, quite peaceful, although without any great luxuries. One early morning, around 4 o'clock, we were awakened by a terrifying crash. It had been raining all night, but that sounded like a gigantic lightning bolt falling on our house. We started to hear screams and people moving outside, so we went out to see. A huge stone had fallen from the mountain, barely 2 houses away from us. It destroyed an entire wall of the neighbor's house. It even fell on top of their dog's little house, but luckily they had let the dog inside that night so it would not suffer so much from the thunder. The thing was that other rocks were at risk of falling at any moment, and they evacuated a large part of the families living at the foot of the mountain that night, while they conducted the necessary studies to determine whether we could return. We had to spend the night away from home. We did something that no one in the family ever did, as far as I know, something no one had ever done. We went to stay at the grandparents' house for the night, just one night. The house where nobody slept but which still served as a meeting place for the family. It was just us, my mother and me, and, well, Mrs. Gertrudis, a 15-year-old Chihuahua that my mother had rescued months before, when her original owner considered putting her to sleep so as not to have to care for her anymore. So that next night, the 3 of us ended up in that house. We were used to visiting it. It was not anything unusual. We brought something to eat and we were calm, just like every visit. My mother told me some childhood stories about her parents, some story I did not know yet, as always. 11 o'clock came, and we went to sleep. Both of us slept in the grandparents' bedroom, because there was no other place. Besides, at the end of their lives, they slept in separate beds, which remained that way. My mother let me sleep in the one I liked best, the one next to the window, and she took the one at the other end, a cold corner of that room. Her little dog snuggled up with her, and without realizing it, we both fell asleep within a few minutes. Something woke me up. Somehow, in a way I cannot explain, I recognized the sound. I had made it myself every time I told that story. The sound seemed to come from the living room. I searched for my phone, afraid to look at the time. It was midnight plus 1 minute. My mother sat up in her bed, and Mrs. Gertrudis began to growl. I was about to get up when my mother told me not to do so. "Do not show yourself," she said to me, as if, for some reason, if someone was outside, they might be looking for me. At least that is how I felt when she said it to me. She left the bedroom, walked a few steps down the hallway toward the living room, where the sound seemed to be coming from. I waited at the door, thinking it could all be a joke, some family member taking revenge on me for my story. But no one knew we were staying there. My mother had not told anyone, so they would not say that the agreement was that no one should spend the night in that house. I lost sight of my mother for a moment when she reached the living room. I waited, peeking from the door. The tapping sound of fingers stopped. My mother appeared, running back down the hallway, emerging from the darkness. Her face was white, as pale as a ghost. She pushed me back into the bedroom and then moved a piece of furniture to block the door. She went to the window to see if she could open it completely and measure the distance from where we were to the ground. "If something comes near, you jump through the window, and I will hand you Gertrudis, okay?" she said to me. But I did not know what to say. I could not agree to that. I asked her what was happening, and she gave me no answer. I asked her 1, 2, 3, 4 times. She did not respond until I told her that if she did not answer me, I would open the door to see for myself. In the living room, there is a woman dressed in black, all in black. She is wearing a veil on her head, and she is sitting in that little armchair where nobody likes to sit. My mother had just described the woman in the photograph. My mother described the one I called Socorro, the ghostly woman who, in my story, returned every night at midnight. But how was that possible? Where did she come from? How could something like that be created, materialized? It made no sense at all. But now the whole family believed in her. Even I knew that my younger cousins feared her more than anything else. They scared them with the witch in the photograph. After a few minutes, the sound stopped completely. My mother's face remained terrified, a terror I had never seen in her before. I told her it was all right, that we could go out, that we should go to the living room, that I knew it would be empty. And we did, this time turning on all the lights first. There was nobody there. We left everything lit up and went back to bed. My mother asked me where I had heard that story, who had told it to me, but I had nothing to say. I did not know how to answer her. I could only swear that it was just a story, nothing more, one of the many stories I had told. The only difference was that this time I found myself with enough elements for so many people to be willing to believe it. Of course, we never stayed in that house overnight again. No one else did either. Hello everyone. I wish to remain anonymous as I share this story, and I apologize in advance if my spelling isn't perfect. Today, I've finally mustered the courage to send it to you, and I hope to hear it on your channel soon. Ever since I was a little girl, my parents always took us from state to state with each of their moves, which they made for work reasons. Eventually, their relationship reached a point where, for that very reason, they got divorced. The constant travel and the great distances between them led them to decide that they would take turns having us, 1 year with one of them, and the following year with the other. It was not that they did not love us, but both had started receiving job offers in different countries, and it was more convenient for them to go alone to these new places and only have us join them once they were settled. Although it was difficult, I never judged them. On the contrary, I am grateful for everything they did to provide a better future for us. The only thing I did not like was being left alone, although, to be honest, I was never completely alone. My brother, who is 4 years younger than I am, was always with me. However, at that time we were not very close, and I only saw him as a child I had to take care of, nothing more. I know it sounds bad, but I was just a girl. Over time, of course, things changed, and now I adore him. Anyway, what I want to tell you happened during one of so many moves, when it was our turn to live with my father in Jalisco, more precisely in Zapopan. I was 11 years old, and my brother was 6. That was the last year we spent in Mexico because the following year we would go live with my mother permanently in the United States. For that reason, in the house where we stayed that entire year with my father, we had almost nothing. I do not remember exactly which part of Zapopan it was, but I know there was a forest nearby, and around it, from what I could see, there were only private gated communities, cul-de-sacs, or whatever you prefer to call them. We lived in one of them. The house we stayed in during that time was big. It had many rooms and a lot of open space, and it looked new. I could swear that all the surrounding houses, including the one we were in, could not have been more than a couple of years old since they were built. That is why, when we moved into that house, I never felt any sort of old, heavy atmosphere, as if many things had happened there before. On the contrary, in that house, I never felt anything at all. I was never afraid to be there. Still, some strange, very strange things happened. As I mentioned before, we had nothing. All we had was a stove, a refrigerator, our beds, a small table, and the internet modem. Other than that, the house was completely empty. The worst part was that since it was so big and had no furniture, you could hear absolutely everything. Every sound echoed through the entire house. You might think I am exaggerating, but I am not. In that house, there was an echo at all hours of the day. You could even hear it if someone tossed coins in a corner of the house or when someone went to the bathroom and turned on the faucet. Every little sound echoed. One night, around midnight, I was still on the phone talking with a friend in my room. Suddenly, I heard something that at that moment I thought was my brother trying to open my door. Slightly annoyed, I just told him to leave me alone and to go to sleep. However, 20 minutes later, while I was still on the phone with my friend, I heard it again. Thinking it was my brother once more, and already somewhat angry, I shouted at him to go to bed and that he should not be awake at that hour. I continued gossiping on the phone with my friend. Exactly 20 minutes after that, I heard someone trying to open my door again. This time, Whoever was on the other side tried to open it with more force, very violently. I was now very angry. I hung up on my friend and got out of bed, shouting as I watched my brother apparently trying to open the door with an unusual amount of anger. "I told you to go to sleep. It is almost 2 in the morning. What are you doing awake?" As I opened the door, I could not even finish what I was yelling because there was no one there. I was not scared, but I was confused. I closed my bedroom door, and as I leaned against it, I finally realized that in that house you could hear everything, and I had never heard my brother get out of his bed, open his bedroom door, or even walk down the hallway to reach my room. While I was thinking about this, I finally heard the sound of my brother's door opening, and then I saw him running out of there toward me. I opened my door immediately and asked him, still annoyed and confused, why he had been trying to open my door like that. He told me it was not him. He said he had been in his room, that he was very cold, and that he felt as though someone was watching him. He told me that he opened his door and felt as if someone had entered his room. I told him to get into my room quickly and ran to his room to grab a blanket. I was very scared, but I had to do it. Someone had to take care of my brother. I ran in without looking around, straight to his bed, took his blanket and a pillow, but the room felt like a freezer. It was a time of the year when we were suffering from the heat in Zapopan. I was practically sweating in my own room, so it was impossible for it to be normal for his room to feel that cold. I quickly took the blanket and pillow, and as I was leaving, I realized that my brother had not gone into my room as I had told him. He was not there. Instead, he was standing in front of the staircase, staring fixedly downward. "Are you all right? I told you to get into my room. What are you looking at?" I asked him. Without answering, he just pointed downstairs and then said, "There is a little girl standing at the bottom of the stairs." I felt an immense horror. I wanted to cry. I concluded that this girl was the one who had been trying to open my door. As quickly as I could, I took my brother by the shoulders and pushed him into my room. While doing so, I tried to peek where he had been looking, but I did not have time to see anything. I ran into my room and we lay down trying to sleep, or at least attempting to. You might wonder where my father was. It might seem like he was not in the house, but he was. However, he was sleeping with his door closed as always, and he slept so heavily that no human power could wake him once he was in deep sleep. In fact, not even shaking him or talking right into his face would wake him. So we were alone. My brother and I waited in my room until we fell asleep. The next day, we told my father about it, but he just laughed, thinking it was some fantasy of ours. It is strange because, as I mentioned at the beginning, that house never made us feel afraid, but it was common to hear noises and to see the lights turning on and off by themselves. Still, that was the only time something different actually showed itself, something that truly tried to come for us, to scare us. Currently, we still remember that event, although my brother and I remember it differently. He does not recall seeing a girl at all. He only remembers feeling as though he was in a trance, and he snapped out of it when I pushed him into my room. But I will never ever be able to forget the horror we experienced that night.